Some of the most beloved songs from the 1970s were hiding something. Behind the radio-friendly melodies and the familiar hooks were stories of obsession, tragedy, addiction, and loss that most listeners never knew were there. Here are the 20 darkest secrets hidden in classic 1970s songs. Number 20, Maggie May by Rod Stewart. Rod Stewart released Maggie May in 1971, and it became one of the defining songs of the decade. It sounds like a warm, rambling story of a young man and an older woman, and it is. But the detail most people glossed over is that the relationship at the center of the song is between a teenage boy and a woman old enough to be his mother, and Stewart has confirmed in interviews that it was drawn from a real experience at the 1961 Beaulieu Jazz Festival when he was a teenager. What sits underneath the cheerful acoustic guitar is a portrait of a young man being used by someone who had no real interest in his future. She keeps him from school, takes his money, and leaves him eventually with nothing to show for it. Stewart delivers it with such good humor. The mandolin, the loose band arrangement, his gruff warmth, that audiences took it as a fond memory of a youthful adventure. It was also a story about exploitation that just happened to have a great melody. The fact that it became one of the most beloved songs of the decade says something interesting about how presentation shapes perception. Wrapped in a different arrangement, the same story might have been difficult to listen to. Number 19, Leader of the Pack by the Shangri-Las. The Shangri-Las released Leader of the Pack in 1964, but it remained in heavy rotation through the early 1970s and became one of the era's most recognizable songs about teenage rebellion. The premise, a girl's motorcycle-riding boyfriend dying in a crash after her parents force her to end the relationship, was dark enough on its own. What made it darker was the sound design. The motorcycle revving, the screeching tires, the crash. It was one of the first pop songs to use sound effects to simulate a death in real time. Teenage audiences loved it. Parent groups were considerably less enthusiastic. The song was actually banned by the BBC for a period, partly because of how graphically it depicted the accident. For a pop song recorded in a single, it carried an unusually heavy emotional punch. That's when I fell for Leader of the Pack. Number 18, Indiana Wants Me. Indiana wants me. Lord, I can't go back. By R. Dean Taylor. R. Dean Taylor's Indiana Wants Me came out in 1970 and reached the top 10 in the United States. On the surface, it sounds like a dramatic pop record. A man on the run, a woman he loves, law enforcement closing in. What the song actually describes, when you follow it closely, is a man who has committed murder and is hiding from the police. The narrator killed a man who insulted his girlfriend and has been a fugitive ever since. By the final moments of the song, the police have surrounded him, and the implication is clear that he is not going to come out alive. For a song that played between bubblegum hits on AM radio, it was an unusually grim story. Taylor's delivery was urgent enough that most listeners felt the tension without necessarily working out exactly what the man had done. Number 17, Sylvia's Mother by Dr. Hook. Sylvia's mother says. Dr. Hook released Sylvia's Mother in 1972, written by Shel Silverstein. It is one of the most emotionally raw songs of the decade, and it does something very specific. It puts the listener inside a single, desperate phone call in which a young man tries to reach a woman he loves and is intercepted at every turn by her mother. Sylvia's mother says, Sylvia's. The dark layer is what is implied rather than stated. Sylvia is clearly being kept from him, almost certainly being married off to someone else or relocated entirely. The mother's cheerful dismissiveness in the face of his obvious anguish is among the more quietly cruel images in 1970s pop. By the time the call ends, it is clear that whatever existed between these two people is over, and that he had no say in it. Silverstein based elements of it on real experience, which gives it a weight that purely fictional songwriting rarely achieves. Sylvia's mother says. Number 16, The Night Chicago Died by Paper Lace. I heard her pray the night Chicago died. Paper Lace had a massive hit with The Night Chicago Died in 1974. It tells the story of a boy whose police officer father was caught in a fictional gun battle between Al Capone's gang and the Chicago Police Department. The song was enormously popular in the United States, despite the fact that virtually every historical detail in it was invented. Al Capone operated on the south side of Chicago, not the east side, as the song describes. There was never a single mass confrontation of the kind the song depicts. Historians and Chicago natives pointed this out repeatedly. None of it affected the song's popularity in the slightest, which is its own kind of commentary on how audiences engage with historical pop songs. The darkness is almost accidental, a romanticized gangster story built on a foundation of complete fiction. Number 15, Shannon by Henry Gross. Henry Gross released Shannon in 1976, and it reached number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100. Most listeners assumed it was a love song about a woman. It was actually written about a dog, specifically the Irish setter, owned by Carl Wilson of the Beach Boys, which had recently died. Gross had been close to Wilson and was genuinely grieving the animal when he wrote it. He has discussed in interviews how he channeled real sorrow into the song without initially explaining what it was about. The name Shannon was the dog's actual name. When the truth came out through press coverage following the song's success, some listeners felt deceived. Others found the song more moving once they understood. A genuine expression of grief for a companion, written with the same emotional vocabulary usually reserved for human relationships. Carl Wilson himself was reportedly touched by the tribute. Either way, millions of people were moved to tears by a song about a dog without knowing it, which raises its own quiet question about how much context actually matters when music is doing its work. Number 14, Dust in the Wind by Kansas. Kansas released Dust in the Wind in 1977, and it became one of the most recognizable ballads of the decade. Guitarist Carrie Livgren wrote it after reading a collection of Native American poetry and being struck by a particular image of human life as temporary and ultimately inconsequential. The song is essentially a meditation on mortality dressed in acoustic guitar. What gives it its weight is how plainly it makes its point. There is no consolation in the lyrics, no suggestion of an afterlife or a larger meaning. Everything that people build, everything they love, everything they are. The song offers none of it any permanence. For a mainstream rock band in the 1970s, that was a genuinely bleak philosophical statement. It remains one of the most melancholy songs to have ever dominated radio. Number 13, Laughter in the Rain by Neil Sedaka. Neil Sedaka's Laughter in the Rain was a 1974 comeback hit that reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in January 1975. It sounds like exactly what it presents itself as, a warm, romantic pop song about a couple walking in the rain. And largely it is. The darker context is Sedaka's career at that point. He had been essentially out of the American market for nearly a decade, dismissed as a relic of the early 1960s teen idol era. The boy who wrote Calendar Girl and Oh Carol, now irrelevant in a world that had moved through the British invasion, psychedelia, and singer-songwriter folk. Elton John, who had become one of the biggest stars in the world by 1974, signed Sedaka to his Rocket Records label almost as an act of deliberate revival. He championed him publicly at a moment when very few others in the industry were paying attention. The song's happiness was real, but layered over years of professional rejection and the particular loneliness of someone who had once been enormously popular and then completely forgotten. The smile in the music was genuine, but what it was pushing back against was not a light thing. Getting a number 1 record in 1975 after nearly a decade of obscurity carries a weight that the cheerful melody doesn't advertise. Number 12, Alone Again, Naturally, by Gilbert O'Sullivan. Alone Again, Naturally. Gilbert O'Sullivan released Alone Again, Naturally in 1972, and it reached #1 in the United States for 6 weeks. It is one of the most cheerfully arranged songs ever written about suicidal ideation and complete despair. The narrator is standing on a tower preparing to jump after being abandoned at the altar. He then reflects on the deaths of his parents and his lifelong experience of loneliness.
May as well go home, as I did on.
O'Sullivan wrapped all of this in a light, piano-driven arrangement, with a melody so pleasant that listeners absorbed it as gentle pop, without necessarily registering what was being said. It is a genuinely unusual achievement, a song about wanting to die that spent a month and a half at #1 in America. O'Sullivan has said in interviews that the content reflected real emotional states he had experienced, which makes the cheerful presentation even more striking.
Alone again, naturally.
Number 11, Cats in the Cradle by Harry Chapin.
The cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon.
Harry Chapin released Cats in the Cradle in 1974, and it went to #1. It was written by Chapin and his wife Sandra, and the story it tells is straightforward. A father too busy to spend time with his son raises a son too busy to spend time with him. The circle closes, and neither of them gets what they actually wanted.
When you're coming home, Dad, I don't know when.
What few people knew at the time was that Chapin felt the song described his own failures. He was a relentless touring musician who was rarely home, and he knew it. He reportedly found it genuinely difficult to perform live because of what it meant to him personally. His wife Sandra has said that she wrote the initial poem partly as a message to him. When he recorded it, he understood exactly what he was singing about. He died in a car accident in 1981 at the age of 38, still touring constantly.
The cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon.
Number 10, Seasons in the Sun by Terry Jacks.
We had joy, we had fun, we had seasons in.
Terry Jacks took Seasons in the Sun to #1 in 1974. It was adapted from a French song by Jacques Brel, with English lyrics by Rod McEwen. The narrator is dying and saying goodbye to the people he loves: his father, his best friend, his girlfriend. It was one of the best-selling singles of 1974 in multiple countries.
We had joy, we had fun, we had seasons in.
What most listeners did not know was that Jacks had originally recorded the song to raise money for a friend who was terminally ill. The Beach Boys had attempted their own version but shelved it. The weight behind the recording was genuine. Jacks was singing about mortality while watching someone he cared about face it directly. The song was criticized at the time by some who found it maudlin. Decades later, it remains one of the most emotionally direct recordings of the decade.
We had joy, we had fun, we had seasons in.
Number 9, Fire and Rain by James Taylor.
I've seen fire and I've seen rain.
James Taylor wrote Fire and Rain in 1970, and it became one of the most personal songs of the singer-songwriter era. The opening verse is about a woman named Suzanne, and for years it was assumed she was a romantic interest. She was actually a friend of Taylor's from his time in a psychiatric institution who had died by suicide. Taylor had been traveling in England and was not told about her death until months later, a decision made by mutual friends who feared his reaction. The second verse addresses his heroin addiction and time in treatment. The third touches on his fear of failure in the music industry. Taylor compressed 3 separate crises into one song without explaining which verse covered which subject, and audiences responded to it as a single, unified emotional experience. The specific detail about Suzanne, that her death was hidden from him, is what gives the first verse its particular grief.
I've seen fire and I've seen rain.
Number 8, The Needle and the Damage Done by Neil Young.
The damage done.
Neil Young performed The Needle and the Damage Done live at Royce Hall in UCLA in January 1971, and it appeared on his Harvest album in 1972. It was written in direct response to watching guitarist Danny Whitten, a member of Crazy Horse, destroy himself with heroin. Young had tried to work with Whitten on what would become the Tonight's the Night sessions, and ultimately had to send him home because his condition made playing impossible. Whitten died of a drug overdose in November 1972, shortly after Young sent him home with $50 and a plane ticket. Young also lost roadie Bruce Berry to heroin the following year. Tonight's the Night, recorded in the aftermath of both deaths, is one of the most grief-saturated albums ever made. The Needle and the Damage Done is the quiet precursor, a 2-minute acoustic song that describes watching addiction claim someone in front of you, written before the worst of it had even happened.
The damage done.
Number 7, Run, Joey, Run by David Geddes. David Geddes released Run, Joey, Run in 1975, and it reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. It is a narrative song, a story song in the tradition of Leader of the Pack, about a teenage girl named Julie whose father confronts her boyfriend Joey with a gun. Julie steps in front of the bullet to protect Joey and dies in his arms. The song includes Julie's voice pleading with her father to stop. The framing is melodramatic in the way that mid-1970s pop story songs often were, but the subject matter, domestic violence, a parent threatening a teenager's partner, a young woman dying because of it, is considerably more disturbing than the arrangement suggests. It was a substantial commercial hit at a moment when no one seemed particularly troubled by what the song was actually about. Number 6, Billy, Don't Be a Hero by Bo Donaldson and the Haywoods. Bo Donaldson and the Haywoods had a number 1 hit in 1974 with Billy, Don't Be a Hero, a song originally recorded by Paper Lace in the UK earlier that same year. The story follows a soldier named Billy who volunteers for a dangerous mission against his fiance's explicit wishes and does not come back. The letter she receives at the end of the song confirms he died carrying out the assignment. The song arrived in the United States while the Vietnam War was still ongoing, and American casualties were still coming home in significant numbers. For many listeners, particularly younger ones, it was not a distant historical narrative or a vague wartime abstraction, but something that mapped directly onto experiences in their own families and communities. Brothers, boyfriends, and husbands were still being lost. The fiancé throwing the letter away at the song's conclusion was read by some as a quiet rejection of the war itself, a refusal to accept the official framing of the death as heroic. The song was more controversial than its pop presentation suggested. Number 5, Angie by the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones released Angie in 1973, and it went to number 1 in multiple countries. For decades, the subject of the song was speculated about. Was Angie a reference to David Bowie's wife Angela, who had a widely discussed relationship with the Stones Circle? Was it about Marianne Faithfull? Keith Richards' daughter, born in 1972, is named Angela, which added another theory. Richards has said that the song was written while he was in a Swiss clinic undergoing heroin detox, that the emotion in it came directly from that experience of loss and longing in an extremely bleak setting. Mick Jagger has been less specific about the inspiration. The song remains genuinely ambiguous, which is part of what has kept people discussing it for 5 decades. Whatever Angie referred to specifically, the sadness in it was not manufactured. Number 4, Wildfire by Michael Martin Murphey. Michael Martin Murphey released Wildfire in 1975, and it reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song tells the story of a girl who died in a blizzard searching for her horse, Wildfire, and whose ghost now rides through storms calling for the narrator to join her. It is a ghost story set to a gentle country pop melody. Murphy has said the core of the story was drawn from local legends and real events in the areas of the Southwest where he grew up. There were genuine historical accounts of people and animals lost in winter storms in that region, and the folklore around them had been part of the landscape of his childhood. He brought that into the studio and surrounded it with a production that was warm, sweeping, and almost comforting in its sound. The disconnect between the music and the subject is what makes it interesting. The girl in the song is dead from the moment the story begins, though the arrangement is so smooth and the melody so inviting that many listeners experienced it as a love song rather than a haunting. The image of a dead girl on a phantom horse calling a living man to join her in the afterlife is, once you stop and actually consider it, one of the stranger concepts to have reached the top 5 of the American charts during the 1970s. Murphy performed it for decades afterward as though it were simply a beautiful song. It is also something else entirely. Number 3, Piano Man by Billy Joel.
Sing us a song, you're the piano man.
Billy Joel released Piano Man in 1973, and it became his signature song. It It is drawn almost entirely from his real experience playing piano at the Executive Room Bar in Los Angeles from 1972 to 1973, during a period when his first record had failed commercially and he was living under an assumed name to avoid his contract with his previous label. Every character in the song was based on someone who was actually there. The real estate novelist, the waitress practicing politics, the old man making love to his tonic and gin. Joel painted them with genuine affection, but also with a clear eye for how much sadness was underneath the Friday night noise. These were people who had ended up somewhere they hadn't planned on, and they were making the best of it. The bar was their version of being somewhere better.
Sing us a song, you're the piano man.
Joel himself was one of them. He was playing covers under the name Bill Martin, hiding from his own industry, unable to make records while his contract situation resolved itself. When he was writing the song that would eventually become his calling card, he spent 6 months in that bar in Los Angeles watching people use music to get through the week. He turned it into something that has outlasted almost everything else from that decade, but the origin, a failed young musician hiding from his own life in a bar full of people escaping theirs, is not the triumphant story the song eventually became.
Sing us a song, you're the piano man.
Number 2, Hotel California by the Eagles.
Welcome to the Hotel California.
The Eagles released Hotel California in 1977, and it became one of the most analyzed songs in rock history. Don Henley has been fairly consistent in explaining what it was about: the seductive excess of California's music industry lifestyle in the mid-1970s, the way success in that world pulled people in and then made it nearly impossible to leave. The band co-wrote it with guitarist Don Felder, who came up with the foundational guitar riff, and Joe Walsh. The darker undercurrents are in the specifics. The hotel where you can check out anytime you like but never leave. The pink champagne on ice. The voices in the corridor. The woman who is both inviting and vaguely menacing. Henley has described it as a song about a person who has crossed a line they cannot uncross, who has given themselves over to something they can't name but can feel closing around them. The California he was writing about was not the sunlit version of the tourist brochures, but a world of very expensive rooms, unlimited supply, and no clear exit.
So I called up the captain, please.
It was written at a moment when the Eagles themselves were inside exactly the kind of excess the song describes. They were one of the biggest bands in America, selling out arenas, and the environment around that success had become something none of them entirely knew how to manage. The production is lush and immaculate. The story it tells is one of entrapment dressed as a rival.
Welcome to the Hotel California.
Number 1, Behind Blue Eyes by The Who.
But my dreams, they are.
The Who released Behind Blue Eyes in 1971 on their Who's Next album. Pete Townshend wrote it originally as part of a Lifehouse, an ambitious multimedia project that eventually collapsed under its own complexity. The song was meant to be sung by a villain in that project, a man who had done terrible things and was fully aware of the gap between how the world saw him and how he actually felt. Townshend has spoken about how deeply personal the song became despite its fictional origins. He identified strongly with the narrator's sense of isolation, the idea of being someone whose inner life was completely invisible to everyone around them, who appeared one way on the outside and felt something entirely different within. The gap between a public face and a private reality was something Townshend understood well. For much of the 1970s, he was one of the most celebrated musicians in the world, and also someone dealing with personal difficulties that very few people around him fully saw.
I love his vengeance.
Roger Daltrey's vocal delivery gives it an emotional authority that made millions of listeners feel understood without quite being able to articulate why. There is something in the song's central image, being misread, being judged on a surface that doesn't match the interior, that connects with people across enormous differences of circumstance. It became one of the most requested and covered songs of the decade, a song built around concealment that somehow made people feel less alone. The original villain that Townshend had written it for was never fully realized. What survived instead was something considerably more lasting.
But my dreams, they are.
Some of the greatest music ever recorded was built on experiences that people would never have wished for. That is the 1970s for you. A decade of extraordinary music with a great deal of darkness underneath it. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There is a lot more waiting for you.